Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another update to the Quebec provincial election series. So, just off the top here, those of you who've watched last week's update would know that I wasn't terribly happy with this region, particularly Saguenay. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, not sure. And I was going to recalibrate the model for that, so I have done that, and that has changed some results. Notably, Parti Québécois is now going to be winning Mata Mapedi. I don't know, my French isn't great. As well as it has actually significantly changed popular vote numbers between the different calibrations, and I did discover, which also affected the U.S. model. It has not affected the conservative leadership race or the Canadian models, but this did affect Quebec and the US ones. So basically, long story short, I was using the wrong data for urbanicity. It was like skewed by one in the data structures. I won't really go into the finicky actual math details of it, but I was using the wrong number. So as we will see here, I have the numbers here. So last week, before I fixed it, to now fixing it, there's also some change of polls too that's also influencing this. But you'll notice the Conservatives are down 4 points. There's a 6 point, let's say 5.5 point gain for the CAQ. Liberals gained about a point. The Quebec Solidarity gained about one and a bit, etc. So, and the others lost quite a bit. So this is a bit awkward, and I feel kind of embarrassed that I had that monumental of a bug in here. To be more specific, I was effectively, and I won't be that specific. It's just, it doesn't matter the exact details, other than the fact that I was using the wrong numbers. Oops. So I fixed that now. I've also double checked things. I think it's probably fine, but as always, if I ever find more bugs or mistakes, I will go in and I will let you guys know why that is changed. Because otherwise, you might think the polling is changing or the models. No, the model was just wrong. Because I made a mistake. Now, let's get back to what's going on in Quebec. Well, there is a very tricky thing with this particular race, is there's just not a good breadth of polling. There's actually quite a bit of polls, but almost all the polls are by Main Street. And as far as I can tell, methodologically speaking, I don't think there's anything wrong with Main Street's polls. The problem is, when you're talking about a model like the one I'm doing, if you're only getting polls from more or less one firm. There was a ledger poll the other day, so that is advantageous. But when you're primarily getting polls from one firm, you lose most of the benefits of an aggregatory model like this, where you can use multiple polls from multiple reputable pollsters and average out the error on them. Well, I can't really do that. The error is heavily baked in. So if the Main Street is right or wrong, is going to really affect the right or wrongness of this model. I have debated whether I should go in and specifically change how I handle polls just for this election. Because right now, I consider all polls, but there's a weighting scheme, so older the poll, the less it's considered. I'm potentially considering maybe only doing the most recent by each pollster, but that has a bunch of problems too, and it would actually reduce the data quite a bit, so I don't really like that model or that methodology. I know some people do it, but it's not my favorite thing in the world. But stay tuned. Next week I'll have made a decision on this, but it does mean there is a lot more uncertainty in this result than I otherwise would normally have. That said, Legault is so dominant, I don't think it's really going to impact much. The only spot where I foresee a lot of potential error creeping in might be the island of Montreal itself. It's very possible that some of these ridings in southern Montreal or over here might be that are currently given to the CAQ in the model could be wrong, because the one ledger poll we had showed that in the Montreal Laval, the CAQ was only sitting about. I need to double check this now. No, that's not the right one. I believe it was sitting at 20%, but I'm just going to double check this. Ledger actually broke this down quite heavily, so I'm bringing it 21%. And the most recent Main Street polls for Montreal Laval area, though I believe the Main Street ones also include some of the suburbs, but so that's a bit of a math consideration there. Anyways, we'll get to that we'll get into that potential if I'm notably wrong in a postmortem. Until then, I'm not going to consider that. The possible different boundaries for these areas. But Main Street has been showing that the Liberals are losing ground in Montreal Laval area and the CAQ's gaining ground. And notably, Main Street has the Quebec Solidaire quite low, but Ledger has Quebec Solidaire quite high, which is interesting because in 2018, both firms pretty much agreed on where Quebec Solidaire was. So this gap here is a big concern for myself in particular, and I'm sure many other people doing this kind of thing have also mentioned it. Because, well, they both agreed last time, and now there's a really big gap. The most recent Main Street poll and the most recent Ledger poll had a 7-point gap in Montreal for the Quebec Solidaire. That's pretty significant. Ledger had about 19 points in Quebec or Montreal Laval. Main Street had about 12. 19 points would mean that they're going to probably hold all these ridings right. So it'd be a 2 pickup for Quebec Solidaire. Though my model does have this one in margin of error right now. But you could be seeing a couple pickups for Quebec Solidaire, and you could be seeing similarly some of these going to Liberals. I can't name all of them because I'm not familiar with all of these, but basically, if Ledger is correct, I think Montreal Laval, you would only see these 2 ridings up here for CAQ and possibly some of these outskirts of Laval. But Main Street completely disagrees, and that's where this is starting to get very difficult. I may or may not decide to do a completely different thing. I might not, because I don't really know. I just don't have the data to really do any fancy things for this. So we'll see. I'm not 100% sure, though. The other possibility, or the other thing too, is in Quebec City itself, there is also a large discrepancy, again, mostly with the Quebec Solidaire numbers and the Conservative Party numbers. So CAQ, Liberals, and Parti Québécois are roughly agreed for Quebec City area and like some of the suburbs of it. But between the 2 firms, Quebec Solidaire is 7 higher for Ledger, and the PCQ is down 6 for Ledger from the most recent Main Street poll. In the Capitale Nationale, which I get a good kick out of, because of course the Quebec calls their capital city the national capital. But so that is also a big concern on my end, because again, those numbers might actually suggest that Eric Doom's not going to win this riding, if the Ledger ones are correct. And it might mean that the Quebec Solidaire is going to hold, I think it's this riding? Jean Talon, I believe, is the one that they were holding. Regardless, that they will hold one of the ridings in Quebec City that they currently have. We'll see which one is more correct. Maybe, if we're lucky, we'll get more polls before October 3rd. Hopefully from more pollsters. Since Ledger polled the 10th to the 12th, or poll was released on the 12th, I think we're going to get another Ledger poll. Sorry, it was the 15th. Anyways, I think we'll get another Ledger poll before the end of the race, just how Ledger normally polls, every 2 weeks, give or take. But let's just say I am very concerned. There is a lot of possible error here. That said, though, both firms both agree that the CAQ in general is so high that I don't think the end result is going to be wrong. We're just talking about marginality of different writings. So, we'll see. Now, the big thing, regardless of which pollster is correct here, and I think has always been the case in this race, is how this will affect things going forward. And to that, the most important thing is whether the Conservative Party actually gets a seat. If they completely fail to get seats, I think the Conservative Party might fizzle out. They get completely 0 seats. If they can get 1 or 2 or however many, I think they can carry that momentum forward and actually keep going somewhere. But again, if they completely fizzle and get 0 seats, it'll be very difficult to keep the momentum going. Right now, they are, from my understanding, getting more donations than the Liberals are, and they're doing better among pretty much everyone outside of Montreal than the Liberals. But can they sustain that if they don't win any seats? We'll see. They do have a big problem, just strategically speaking, because the strongest areas for the Conservative Party around Quebec City and around this area, I can't think of the proper term for this region, but anyways, in those areas where they're the strongest, the CAQ is also the strongest, and the CAQ is very dominant right now, especially among Francophones. So it really makes it a very tricky electoral math for the PCQ. Now, we'll see how this goes. There's always, especially in the rate, considering in the considerations of the Quebec polling, the Ledger poll actually had more detail in it of the sub-regions of Quebec, which I actually really appreciate. Though, unfortunately, since it's only the most recent Ledger poll with that level of detail, I probably can't really make much use of that level of detail. And that could have a very strong effect on different sub-regions, like this sub-region, for example. Because, okay, so if we go here, these are the main sub-regions that have been polled in Quebec for a while. Sometimes they'll poll Montreal and the suburbs of Montreal separately. Ledger actually broke up the rest of Quebec into all of the different parts. The actual administrative subregions. And that actually, if a lot of polls are like that, would have actually been enough detail for me to do a lot more sophisticated stuff and might actually have would improve the model a bit. But Main Street's only doing it in 3 levels. So, since we're talking about almost all Main Street polls and a few Ledger polls, and it's only the most recent Ledger poll that broke this up, there's just not enough data points to actually do math on this. Like, if I had enough data points of all the different subregions, I could do some statistical interpolation and convert the Main Street data to the same kind of data. It wouldn't be perfectly accurate, but in general terms, it's going to be close enough. And how accurate these things are. But I don't have enough. I only have one data point of Ledger doing it. So maybe if Ledger does it again, I might try to recalibrate that, though that would be a colossal amount of work. But if it makes the model better, it's worth doing. The big rub here, and I gotta say my big gripe with this entire election is just, where's all the other pollsters at, though? Where are they at? You look at 2018, there was quite a few. There was plenty of pollsters polling in 2018. And now it's 2? Like, what? Like, you look at the September period in 2018, you had polls from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different pollsters, as far as I can count. And at this point, we've only had polls from 2. Now, Main Street, instead of polling every 2 weeks, give or take, has now been polling every day. So in that regard, that's a nice thing. But we're completely missed out on a bunch of other firms, and now we have polls that are really over-biased to Main Street. So we'll see. I guess there could be worse things. You could have a really bad pollster doing all the polling. At least Main Street is generally good. The other thing that is worth noting, too, which we are starting to see in this polling data, is there's a very large discrepancy among 18 to 34s. Though those of you who are my regular viewers will note that this isn't that out there. 18 to 34 vote block discrepancy in Canada has existed pretty much always. At least in the last 2 years. The online panels strongly suggest youth are very left-wing. I mean, for example, in Quebec, Ledger has Quebec's Ledger at 38%. And Conservatives at 18%. And everyone else somewhere else. Main Street has the Conservatives at 31% and Quebec Solidaire only at 25%. That is a 33 percentage point difference between the two pollsters. And even in the exact same polling days, the numbers are different by a similar margin. And that makes an interesting dilemma. Which one is right? This is far outside of margin of error. These are two completely different numbers. The margin of error on both of them, I believe, is 3, give or take. Though with this subsample, maybe we could even be generous and say the margin of error is 5. So then it's still 23 points out of margin of error. Out of the slimmest consideration of being in margin of error. And that's a very interesting dilemma. This is not the first time it is. When you poll federally, you'll see frequently Main Street or Ecos or even Nanos will have the Conservatives doing much better relative to the NDP than, say, Ledger or Abacus typically do. And why is that? Well, I don't know. The notable difference here is that the telephone-based polls do have the Conservatives doing better among youth, typically, and the online panels have them worse. They typically, both formats, agree on middle-aged, so typically 35 to 54, and the online polls say that the Conservatives do better among 55 plus, and the telephone polls say they do worse. Similar things with the NDP, or the Quebec Solidaire, in the case of Quebec. Though that, the 55 plus category in the case of Quebec, is so dominated by Legault that it's not really noticeable. It's very muted because he's getting like over 55% of the vote there or something like that. I mean, I can actually just tell you. My model forecast, yeah, 55% is what they forecast. My model forecasts that he's going to get of that demographic. So, why? Why do we have this big polling difference? Because again, Main Street and Ledger are both very good, very reliable polling firms. They occasionally have misses, but overall, they're very good. So why? Well, there's two possible reasons that I've seen. The first one, which I'm not 100% sold on, is that the people who the young people who answer phones for polls don't represent the population of young people. And while I think that is actually true, I don't really like it as an explanation because I also don't think the people who answer online polls among young people are representative of the population. I'm also, to be honest, I am very skeptical of online polls in general. I understand why the industry is moving towards them because it's very hard to get people on live calls these days. But the problem is to sign up for a panel like the Ledger panel, the Angus Reid panel, you have to sign up to answer polls online. So you already have to be either really bored or very politically active to want to do that. And you need a lot of free time because I've answered polls sometimes on online panels, and it's time consuming. It takes 10, 15 minutes sometimes. Not a lot of people have that time. Like, sure, maybe they don't have the time to answer the phone call, but there's a difference. So, like, I don't think either group really represents the general population very well. That gets less bad as you get older, as older people tend to have more time, either because they're retired or they just don't go out as much. Young people do, generally speaking, do more things than older people. Shocking. So, can we do anything about this, right? Like, are we just doomed to having these models and these polls just wildly guessing at young people? Yeah, I think we are because the... Oh, I forgot the other reason here, sorry. So the first reason some people have suggested, and I think it's some credibility to recap, is that the telephone polls aren't capturing the right type of people. The second possible reason is that this group of people is... Young people are that volatile of a group. This one I'm actually much more sympathetic to because based off of my personal experience with people my age, I'm 24, and my friends talking to them, there are people in my friend group who, federally speaking, would be willing to vote or have voted NDP before, but are willing to consider voting for Poilievre. And very few would consider voting Liberal, for that matter. So, I think it's very much just a case that this is a group of people, because, again, the older you are, the more set in your beliefs you are, the more set in your worldview you are. It very much might be the case that young people are just extremely volatile. And you do see that to a certain extent with Main Street. Every day there's a relatively small change among the oldest demographic and can be relatively large changes in the youngest demographic. Okay. That would lend credence to it. Ledger doesn't poll frequently enough, in my opinion, to really like meaningfully see, because if we're talking about being polled every 2 weeks, well, your opinion could change quite easily in 2 weeks. You look at the daily rolling polls by Main Street right now, in the span of a day, you can have like 4 or 5 point swings in the 35 group, 30 less than 35 group. So I'm strongly of the opinion that that might be the case. I think it's very possible that these samples are not representative. That's very possible. But unfortunately, we can't really know unless people or some group starts paying for en masse exit polls. And you'd really want to do like a proper good exit poll, which is you'd want to have, let's say, there's about 125 ridings in Quebec, so you'd want to randomly sample, or let's go precincts. Let's say there's 5,000 precincts in Quebec. I don't actually know what it is, but let's say 5,000. You don't want to randomly sample, say, 500 of them and send people there and interview a couple hundred people coming, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people total. Let's go to 5,000. Interview 5,000 people, say, at 500 different precincts. Get all their demographic data and who they voted for, okay? Then we could probably actually answer the question where this is, if we did this. Because then we should have a good idea of how people actually voted. Unfortunately, Canada doesn't seem to do any exit polls. There's exit polls in Sweden, there's exit polls in the US, there's even exit polls at state level races in the US. Not always. At least not always available years later. PDFs might have died, or the links might have died. But they exist. Same thing in France. So why don't we have exit polls? It would really answer this question. I think that's the only way to really answer it. So, But to wrap up the video here, I'll just say this. So this is what the model says. I'm not going to change anything based on what I think. Like, I'm pretty sure that Quebec the Liberals are probably going to be doing slightly better in Montreal than they are. Maybe Quebec still are too. Not really sure. But I'm not going to change that. I'm just going to accept that my model might be wrong. And I'll be honest, if I do have a major miss on this one, which, again, we are, 17 days away from the election, so a bit early to prognosticate that. Unless we start seeing a lot more polls before Election Day, I'm not really going to bother doing any changes probably based off this election. Unless, again, of course, we get a lot of polls, because if I'm wrong because there's only one pollster polling, I mean, that doesn't tell me anything. It's actually the most disappointing version of this. I would rather be wrong and have a lot of pollsters polling so I can actually, check to see if my model's good. But if I'm wrong and there's only really one pollster polling, I don't know if my model's any good or if the polls are bad. So I guess to a certain extent there's some there, but it's not a lot. But we'll see. But if you like the video, by all means, like, share, subscribe. Comment below what you think. If you think there's anything wrong with the projection, or you think I'm over or underestimating people, or whatever it be. And, I will see you guys next week for another Quebec update. And I have a U.S. congressional update and the Conservative leadership race post-mortem coming this week. So stay tuned for that. Otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful day.